I never planned to become the woman who crossed that line. For 15 years, I'd stood behind lecterns at 3 different universities, guiding thousands of students through the complexities of American literature. I'd established clear boundaries, maintained professional distance, earned tenure based on merit and dedication. I was Dr. Eleanor Winters, respected scholar, reliable colleague, divorced but content at 43, my life organized into predictable rhythms of semesters and sabbaticals. Then Daniel Marshall walked into my Advanced American Modernism seminar on a rainy Tuesday in September, and something shifted that I wouldn't recognize until it was too late. He wasn't particularly striking at first glance, tall and lean with dark hair that fell slightly into his eyes, perpetually dressed in worn jeans and button-downs with rolled sleeves. 23, a senior who had returned after taking 2 years off to care for his ailing father. Nothing about him should have registered differently from the dozens of other students filling the tiered seats of Hamilton Hall. But when he spoke for the first time, challenging my interpretation of Eliot's Prufrock, there was something in his voice, a quiet certainty, an intellectual maturity that made me pause. I think we're missing something essential if we focus solely on the narrator's paralysis, he said, his eyes meeting mine without hesitation. There's a deeper question about authentic connection that transcends his social anxiety. The air in the classroom seemed to still as he built his argument, referencing not just the assigned reading, but drawing connections to Whitman and Dickinson we wouldn't cover until November. Other students shifted uncomfortably. This level of intellectual challenge wasn't typical in the first week, but I found myself leaning forward, engaged in a way I hadn't been in semesters. "Interesting perspective, Mr. Marshall," I responded, keeping my tone measured despite the unexpected flutter in my chest. Though I'd argue Eliot's precision with alienation is precisely what distinguishes his work. He smiled then, not the defensive smile of a student being corrected, but the satisfied expression of someone who'd achieved exactly what he'd intended, igniting a genuine debate. "Perhaps both can be true simultaneously, Professor," he countered. "The alienation serves as the vehicle for the deeper exploration." I remember nodding, moving on to another student's raised hand, but feeling his gaze remain on me. Attentive, thoughtful. That night, reviewing my lecture notes, I found myself dwelling on our exchange, mentally extending our debate, imagining the points I might raise next class. It was just intellectual stimulation, I told myself. Just the pleasure of encountering a truly engaged mind. Nothing more. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Daniel's comments were always insightful, pushing discussions deeper. He never dominated the classroom. He was too socially aware for that. But when he spoke, the energy in the room shifted. I began to anticipate his contributions, to wonder what perspective he might bring to each new text. After the midterm, I wasn't surprised to find his essay stood far above the others, not just in analysis, but in the quality of his writing, the originality of his thinking. I gave him an A+, with a note suggesting he consider graduate studies if he wasn't already planning on it. When he came to my office hours the following week, I assumed it was to discuss the paper. My office in the English department was small but comfortable, bookshelves lining the walls, a window overlooking the maple trees that turned crimson each October. I'd left the door partway open, as was my habit during official hours. "Your paper was exceptional," I said as he settled into the chair across from my desk. "You have a natural gift for close reading." "Thank you," he replied. But he seemed distracted, his eyes moving across the books behind me. "You have an amazing collection here. Hazard of the profession. 20 years of not being able to resist bookstores." He smiled, noticing the weathered copy of Leaves of Grass on my desk. "Whitman, my father's favorite. He used to read Song of Myself aloud on summer evenings." There was something in the way he said it, a vulnerability beneath the casual tone, that made me ask, "How is your father now?" His face shifted, guard dropping momentarily. "He passed away last spring. That's why I finally came back to finish my degree." "I'm sorry for your loss," I said, meaning it. "That couldn't have been easy, taking care of him while putting your education on hold." He shrugged slightly. "He was an English teacher, high school. Literature was our common language. Being his caretaker taught me more than any classroom could have. Is that why you're so advanced in your analysis? Learning from him? Partly, he admitted. But also, he hesitated, then continued with surprising directness. I've been following your work for years. Your book on female modernist poets was what made me want to take this course, even though I'd already fulfilled my requirements. I felt a flush of pleasure at the compliment, though I tried to maintain professional composure. That's very flattering. But you didn't come here to discuss my book, did you? He leaned forward slightly, his eyes, a deep brown I hadn't properly noticed before, holding mine. Actually, I did. I'm working on my senior thesis on gender subversion in modernist poetry. Your perspective on Amy Lowell's imagery has shaped my thinking, but I've been struggling with how to incorporate HD's later work. Just an academic conversation, I reminded myself, as we dove into a discussion that stretched far beyond my scheduled office hours. Just a promising student seeking guidance. The way my pulse quickened when he disagreed with me, or the warm satisfaction when he built brilliantly on my suggestions. That was just the natural response to intellectual connection. But as weeks passed, as our conversations extended beyond class and scheduled meetings, something was changing that I couldn't, or wouldn't, name. The way I found myself paying more attention to my appearance on days I knew I'd see him. How I'd feel a flicker of disappointment when he missed class. The dreams that began to feature his hands turning pages, his voice speaking poetry. I wasn't naive. I recognized attraction when I felt it. But I was old enough, experienced enough, professional enough to know better. He was my student. The power dynamic alone made any possibility unethical, not to mention university policy. And beyond that, he was 20 years younger, for heaven's sake. Surely this was just a misplaced maternal instinct or, more likely, loneliness after 3 years of being single following my divorce. Then came the evening that shifted everything irreversibly. I was giving a public lecture on campus about Edna St. Vincent Millay's sonnets, a talk scheduled months before, part of the university's humanities series. The auditorium was half-filled, mostly faculty and graduate students, with a scattering of undergrads seeking extra credit. I spotted Daniel in the third row as I arranged my notes at the podium, felt a now familiar flutter when he nodded slightly in greeting. The lecture went well. I lost myself in Millay's fierce independence, her defiance of gender expectations, the way her sonnets reclaimed female desire. Only when I quoted the lines, "I shall forget you presently, my dear, so make the most of this, your little day," did I find my eyes drifting to Daniel, my voice catching briefly before I continued. Afterward, as the crowd thinned and colleagues stopped to offer compliments, I noticed him lingering near the edge of the stage, a worn copy of Millay's collected works in his hands. When the last faculty member drifted away, he approached. "That was extraordinary, Professor," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. "The way you connected her personal rebellion to her formal innovations, it made me see her work completely differently." "Thank you," I replied, gathering my papers, suddenly aware we were almost alone in the auditorium. "I'm glad you could make it. I wouldn't have missed it." He hesitated, then held out the book. "Would you mind signing this?" It was my father's copy. The request surprised me. Students occasionally asked me to sign my own book, but never someone else's work. Yet something about the gesture touched me. I took the volume, noting the dog-eared pages, the margin notes in faded blue ink. "Your father had good taste," I said, opening to the title page. "What should I write?" He looked at me then, with an expression I couldn't decipher, something beyond academic admiration, something that made my hand unsteady as I held the pen. "Whatever you feel is right," he said. I wrote simply, "For Daniel. Continue to read with your father's passion and your own insight. Eleanor Winters." Using my first name felt strangely intimate, but Dr. Winters seemed too formal for a book this personal. When I handed it back, our fingers brushed momentarily. Neither of us immediately pulled away. "Thank you," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Would you like to get coffee, to discuss Millay further?" I should have declined. Should have remembered my position, the boundaries that needed to remain intact. "There's a cafe still open just off campus," I heard myself say instead. The Golden Pear was dimly lit and nearly empty at 8 o'clock on a Wednesday. We settled at a corner table with our drinks, chamomile tea for me, black coffee for him. Without the classroom or my office surrounding us, something shifted in our dynamic. Here, we were just two people discussing literature in the soft evening light. Our conversation flowed from Millet to his thesis, to books we loved, to the small Vermont town where he'd grown up with his father, a single parent after his mother left when Daniel was 10. "That must have shaped you significantly," I observed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. "It did," he nodded. Watching him rebuild his life after she left, he turned to literature as a form of survival. Poetry became our family language. He smiled slightly. "He would have been starstruck meeting you. He assigned your essays to his AP classes." "You make me sound ancient," I laughed, but felt a warming pleasure at his words. "Not ancient," he said, his eyes meeting mine over his coffee cup. "Accomplished. Brilliant." There was something in his gaze, a directness, an admiration that wasn't merely academic, that made me glance away, suddenly aware of the dangerous territory we were approaching. "Tell me about your thesis," I said, steering us back to safer ground. "How's the new section coming?" He allowed the deflection, but something had changed in the air between us. As he spoke about his work, I found myself noticing details I'd tried to ignore before. The thoughtful way he paused before answering complex questions, the subtle strength in his hands as he gestured to emphasize points, the intellect behind his eyes that made him seem older than his 23 years. He was my student, yes, but in that moment, in that cafe, I saw him as a man, thoughtful, perceptive, fully formed in his own right. When we finally left, the night had turned cool, the October air crisp with the promise of coming winter. He walked me to my car, our conversation continuing as if neither of us wanted the evening to end. "Thank you for this," he said as we reached my sedan in the nearly empty parking lot. "For seeing me as a colleague rather than just a student." "You're hardly just a student, Daniel," I replied, keenly aware we were standing closer than strictly necessary. "Eleanor," he said, my first name sounding different in his voice, laden with unspoken meaning. He'd never used it before. In class, I was always professor or doctor. Winters. I knew I should correct him, re-establish the formality of our relationship. Instead, I stood silent, my heart beating too quickly as he took a half-step closer. "I know this is complicated," he continued, his voice low. "I know all the reasons why I shouldn't say what I'm thinking, but I've never met anyone who understands me the way you do, who sees literature, sees the world, with the same intensity." "Daniel," I finally managed, "you're my student. There are boundaries. I'm a human being first," he interrupted gently. "So are you. What's happening between us? It's not about power dynamics or grades or academia. It's about connection." "It's not that simple," I said, though part of me wished desperately that it could be. "No," he agreed. "It's not simple, but it's real." He didn't touch me, didn't try to kiss me as part of me feared or hoped he might. He simply held my gaze for a long moment, then stepped back. "Think about it," he said. "That's all I'm asking. Just acknowledge that what we're feeling isn't wrong, just complicated." I drove home in a state of emotional turmoil, his words echoing in my mind. Was he right? Was there something real between us beyond the student-teacher relationship, beyond the flattery of a younger man's attention? Or was I projecting depth onto what was merely inappropriate attraction? For the next week, I maintained strict professionalism in class, called on other students more than him, avoided making eye contact longer than necessary. He respected my unspoken request for distance, participating in discussions, but not lingering afterward, not showing up at office hours. But his absence created its own presence. I found myself thinking about him constantly, replaying our conversations, wondering what he was working on, if he was confused by my sudden coolness. At night, I'd lie awake examining my feelings with the same critical analysis I'd apply to a literary text, trying to separate truth from self-deception. The reality I couldn't escape was that I was drawn to him in ways that transcended physical attraction. I admired his mind, his perception, his emotional maturity. In him, I saw a kindred spirit, someone who understood literature as a way of making sense of human experience, who read not just with intelligence, but with heart. And yes, I was attracted to him as a man. The 20-year age gap that should have been insurmountable seemed to dissolve when we discussed Whitman or Dickinson, when he challenged my interpretations with observations so insightful they changed my own understanding of texts I'd taught for decades. 2 weeks after our cafe conversation, he stayed after class as other students filed out. "Professor," he said formally, though no one remained to overhear, "I want to apologize if I made you uncomfortable. That wasn't my intention." I glanced at the open door, very aware of where we were. "You didn't," I said carefully. "But this isn't the place to discuss it." "Will there be a place?" he asked directly. "Or are you choosing to pretend this isn't happening?" His bluntness startled me. Most students, most people, approach difficult conversations indirectly, with cushioning language and face-saving ambiguity. Daniel's straightforwardness was yet another quality that made him seem older than his years. "My office," I said. "Tomorrow at 4. My last appointment ends at 3:30. When he arrived the next day, I closed my office door, something I rarely did during office hours. But this conversation demanded privacy. He noticed immediately, his eyebrows rising slightly as I returned to my seat behind the desk. "I've been thinking about what you said," I began, having rehearsed these words carefully. "About connection. About being human beings first." He nodded, waiting for me to continue rather than jumping in. "You're right that there's something between us that goes beyond the typical professor-student relationship. I value your intellect, your perspective, your maturity. In another context, perhaps we could explore what that means. But here, now, with me as your professor, we simply can't." "I understand the professional constraints," he said, "and I would never ask you to compromise your position here. But I graduate in December." The implication hung in the air between us. After December, I wouldn't be his professor. The institutional barriers would dissolve. "Even then," I said, choosing my words with care, "the age difference is significant," he finished for me. "But is it truly meaningful?" "I'm not some naive boy, Eleanor. I've lived through my father's illness and death. I've supported myself since I was 20. I know who I am and what I want." "And what is it you want exactly?" I asked, needing clarity despite the danger of the question. "A chance," he said simply. "Not promises, not commitments. Just permission to see who we might be to each other, without these roles between us." I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a student, but a man who had weathered personal hardship and emerged with compassion intact. A man who read poetry with the same hunger I did, who understood the world through language and metaphor as I always had. "December," I finally said, the word both a boundary and a possibility. "We can talk then, not before." Relief and something like joy flickered across his face. "I can wait," he said. The weeks that followed required a discipline I hadn't needed to exercise in years. In class, I maintained absolute professionalism, treating him exactly as I did other students. He did the same, participating appropriately without seeking special attention. To any observer, nothing would have seemed unusual, but beneath that surface, awareness hummed like an electrical current. When he handed in papers, our fingers avoided touching. During discussions, our eyes rarely met directly. We constructed an elaborate dance of distance that paradoxically made me more conscious of him than ever before. November brought the first snowfall, and with it, a campus event that tested our careful boundaries. The English department hosted its annual faculty-student mixer, a formal affair at the university president's house, meant to help promising students network with professors outside their immediate specialties. As Daniel's professor, I could hardly avoid attending, and as one of our top seniors, neither could he. I spent more time than I cared to admit choosing my outfit, settling finally on a deep blue dress that was professional yet flattering. My one concession to vanity, a pair of silver earrings that brought out the silver strands in my otherwise dark hair. I'd never been ashamed of my age, of the lines beginning to form at the corners of my eyes, or the streaks of gray I'd earned. But that night, catching my reflection as I applied lipstick, I wondered how he saw me, if the 20 years between us seemed as vast to him as they sometimes did to me. The president's house was crowded when I arrived, faculty in dark suits mingling with students dressed in their best attempts at professional attire. I was speaking with the chair of religious studies when I felt a shift in the air, a awareness that had nothing to do with sight. Turning slightly, I saw Daniel across the room in a charcoal suit that transformed him from casual student to poised adult. Our eyes met briefly before we both looked away, returning to our separate conversations. Throughout the evening, we orbited each other carefully, always with others between us, always maintaining propriety. Yet somehow, I was constantly aware of where he was, what he was doing, who he was speaking with. Several times I caught colleagues looking at him with impressed expressions as he discussed his thesis work or his post-graduation plans for graduate school. "Marshall's quite exceptional," commented Dr. Harrison, our department chair, appearing at my elbow with a glass of wine. "I understand he's working with you on his thesis?" "Yes," I replied, keeping my tone casual. "He has a unique perspective on gender subversion in modernist poetry. Cambridge has expressed interest in him for their graduate program, as has Columbia." Harrison continued, "You should be proud. Your influence is evident in his work." I murmured something appropriate, but his words struck me with unexpected force. My influence. Was that all this was? A brilliant student absorbing his mentor's perspectives, mistaking intellectual affinity for deeper connection? Across the room, Daniel laughed at something the medieval literature professor said, the sound carrying over the murmur of conversations. I watched him, confident, engaged, holding his own among scholars 3 times his age, and felt a surge of something complex. Pride in his abilities, yes, but also a recognition that he was very much his own person, with a mind that had been developing long before he entered my classroom. As the evening wound down, I found myself near the coat check at the same moment he was collecting his jacket. "You made quite an impression on Harrison," I said quietly, as he helped me into my wool coat. "And Professor Chambers. They're both on the graduate recommendation committee." "I wasn't trying to impress anyone," he replied, his voice equally low. "Except maybe you." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. Before I could respond, another faculty member approached, and the moment passed. Outside, the night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above the campus. I had parked some distance away, and without discussion, Daniel fell into step beside me. "3 more weeks," he said after we'd walked in companionable silence for a minute. "Then finals, graduation, and I'm no longer your student." "Yes," I acknowledged, our breath clouding in the winter air. "I've been thinking about what happens then," he continued, "about how to do this right." "This?" I asked, though I knew exactly what he meant. "Us," he said simply. "Whatever we might become to each other." We reached my car, stopping beneath a street lamp that cast a soft glow over the deserted parking lot. In the crystalline December air, everything felt heightened. The cold against my cheeks, the sound of distant laughter from students crossing the quad, the way he looked at me with unwavering directness. "I'd like to take you to dinner," he said. "The day after graduation, not as your student, not on campus, just as Daniel, taking Eleanor to dinner." The way he framed it, so straightforward, so clear in its intentions, disarmed my well-rehearsed objections. "All right," I heard myself say. "Dinner." His smile then, genuine, warm, lighting his eyes, made him look both younger and somehow older simultaneously, joy stripping away the seriousness that usually marked his features. "I'll count the days," he said, and I knew he meant it literally. The final weeks of the semester passed in a blur of papers, exams, and departmental meetings. Daniel submitted his thesis, a brilliant analysis that would certainly help secure his place in any graduate program he chose. I graded it with the same rigor I applied to all senior work, though I found myself lingering over his prose, recognizing patterns in his thinking that resonated with my own. Graduation day arrived clear and cold. I sat on the platform with other faculty, watching as students crossed the stage to receive their diplomas. When Daniel's name was called, our eyes met briefly as he accepted the embossed folder. In that moment, something shifted, the roles of professor and student beginning to dissolve, leaving just two people with a connection yet to be defined. The next evening, I stood in my bedroom, considering and rejecting outfits with an anxiety I hadn't felt in decades. We had agreed to meet at Oriole, an upscale restaurant downtown, far from campus and unlikely to be frequented by university colleagues. Still, I was acutely aware that moving from theoretical possibility to actual date carried risks, to my reputation, to my peace of mind, perhaps even to my heart. I finally chose a simple black dress I'd had for years, but rarely wore. Elegant without trying too hard, revealing enough to acknowledge this wasn't a professional meeting, while still appropriate for a woman my age. My hands trembled slightly as I fastened a silver necklace, applied perfume with more care than usual. He was already at the table when I arrived, standing as I approached. The restaurant was intimate, candlelit, with white tablecloths and soft jazz playing discreetly in the background. "You look beautiful," he said as I took my seat. The compliment simple but genuine. "Thank you," I replied, surprisingly nervous now that we were here, now that the boundaries of academia had fallen away. "Congratulations again on graduation, and the departmental honors." "Thank you," he smiled, "though I have my professor to thank for much of that." "Your work earned those honors, not my guidance," I said firmly. "Always deflecting compliments," he observed, his eyes warm. "That's something I've noticed about you, Eleanor. You're more comfortable analyzing texts than accepting praise." The personal observation, accurate and perceptive, reminded me that this wasn't a first date in the conventional sense. He had been watching me, learning me, for months, just as I had been learning him. "Speaking of analyzing texts," I said, steering toward familiar territory, "have you decided on Cambridge or Columbia?" A slight shadow crossed his face. "Actually, I've been offered a fellowship at the University of California. Berkeley has an interdisciplinary program combining literature with cultural studies that aligns perfectly with my interests." "Berkeley," I repeated, processing the information. "That's quite far from here." 3,000 miles, he acknowledged. "I've been meaning to tell you, but wanted to do it in person." I took a sip of water, surprised by the sharp disappointment I felt. "It's an excellent program. You should be proud." "I am," he said. "But it complicates things between us." The directness I'd come to expect from him. No games, no evasions. "Perhaps it's for the best," I said, giving voice to the rational thoughts I'd been having for weeks. "This, whatever it might have been, carries complications we've barely begun to consider. The department would never understand. The age difference alone—" "Stop!" he interrupted gently. "For tonight, can we set aside all the reasons why this might be difficult? Can we just be two people sharing a meal, getting to know each other beyond the classroom?" His request was reasonable, and I found myself nodding, consciously setting aside my concerns as our waiter approached for drink orders. What followed was one of the most engaging evenings I'd experienced in years. Without the constraints of our previous roles, conversation flowed freely, from books to music, to travel to the deeper territories of loss, hope, and purpose. He told me about caring for his father through the final stages of cancer, about rediscovering his passion for literature in those dark months. I shared stories of my divorce, my struggle to find balance between academic success and personal fulfillment. "I've dated since then," I admitted over dessert, the wine having loosened my usual reserve. "But most men my age seem settled, as if they've already decided who they are and what life should be." "And you haven't?" he asked, genuinely curious. I considered the question seriously. "I know who I am professionally, but personally? I think we're always becoming, always in process. The moment you decide you're finished evolving is the moment you start to calcify." He nodded slowly, understanding. "That's what drew me to you from the beginning. The way you approach text and life, with genuine curiosity. No fixed interpretations, just ongoing exploration. The observation was so personal, so insightful about something I rarely articulated even to myself, that I felt momentarily exposed, seen in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Berkeley is far," I said, returning to the reality we'd temporarily set aside. "And you'll be immersed in a new world, surrounded by brilliant peers your own age. Distance is challenging," he acknowledged, "but not insurmountable." He reached across the table then, his fingers lightly touching mine in our first deliberate contact. "I'm not asking for promises, Eleanor. Just possibility." His touch sent warmth spreading through me, a physical manifestation of the connection that had been building between us for months. "Possibility," I repeated, not pulling my hand away. "I think I can manage that." When he walked me to my car later, the night air cool around us, I knew we had reached the moment of decision. The careful distance we'd maintained was dissolving, leaving us in uncharted territory. "Hi, I leave for California in 3 weeks," he said, standing close enough that I could feel his warmth in the chilly night. "I'd like to see you again before then, if you want that too." In answer, I did what I'd been thinking about for longer than I cared to admit. I stepped forward, eliminating the last space between us, and kissed him. His response was immediate, his arms encircling me with a gentleness that belied their strength. The kiss deepened, and I felt an awakening of something I'd feared might be permanently dormant. Desire, yes, but also possibility. The sense that life could still surprise me, still offer unexpected joy. When we finally separated, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "I've been wanting to do that since October," he confessed, his voice low. "I know," I smiled. "I think I have too, though I wouldn't admit it to myself." The 3 weeks that followed were a revelation. Stolen days and evenings away from campus, learning each other as equals rather than professor and student. We drove to the coast for a weekend, walked deserted winter beaches, talked for hours by firelight in a small inn where nobody knew us. I rediscovered parts of myself I'd relegated to memory. Spontaneity, passion, the ability to be fully present with another person. And yes, we became lovers. A step I took with eyes wide open, aware of the 20 years between us, but finding, in the intimacy of private moments, that chronological age mattered less than the depth of connection, the genuine recognition of each other as kindred spirits. His departure for Berkeley arrived too quickly. At the airport, surrounded by travelers rushing toward destinations unknown, we held each other with the awareness that whatever had begun between us now faced its first real test. "This isn't goodbye," he said, his hands warm against my face. "It's just intermission." "A very long intermission," I replied, trying to keep my tone light despite the heaviness in my chest. "Focus on your studies, Daniel. Don't let this, us, distract you from what you've worked for." "I won't," he promised. "But don't use that as an excuse to pull away. I know how your mind works, remember? You'll start constructing rational arguments for why this can't possibly work." I smiled despite myself, caught in my own predictable patterns. "I'll try to keep an open mind." "That's all I ask," he said, kissing me one last time before walking toward the security line, turning back once to find me still watching. That was 8 months ago. Since then, we've navigated the complexities of long-distance connection, weekly video calls, unexpected packages of books with personal inscriptions, a visit during spring break when I flew to California and saw him flourishing in his new academic environment. We've kept our relationship private, aware that even without the professor-student dynamic, many would struggle to understand what exists between us. I don't know what the future holds for us. The rational part of me, the part that has built a successful academic career through careful analysis, can list all the reasons why this relationship faces challenges. The age difference that will become more pronounced as years pass. The geographical separation, the potential professional complications should our connection become known. But the part of me that fell in love with literature precisely because it illuminates the mystery and complexity of human experience knows something else. That genuine connection is rare, that relationships defy easy categorization, that the heart recognizes its counterpart in unexpected places. He was my student, yes, but in his eyes, I saw a man, not a boy. And in that recognition, I found myself anew, not as professor or mentor, but simply as Eleanor, a woman still becoming, still open to the surprises life offers those brave enough to accept them.